The phone rang at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October 2024, cutting through the desert silence that had settled over Phoenix like a shroud. Detective Azura Lane's weathered hand reached for the receiver, her calloused fingers wrapping around the cool plastic as she lifted it to her ear. The voice on the other end belonged to Lieutenant Marcus Rivera, his words measured but trembling with the weight of 16 years. "Azura, we got him. DNA match on the Hernandez case. You need to get down here." The receiver slipped from her grip, clattering against the nightstand as memories flooded back like a dam bursting in her chest. Sofia Hernandez, 8 years old, pigtails tied with yellow ribbons that matched the desert sunflowers her mother had planted in their small front yard. The case that had haunted Azura's dreams, turned her hair prematurely silver and carved lines around her eyes deeper than any Arizona canyon. 16 years. 16 years of following dead leads, interviewing suspects who walked free, staring at evidence boards covered with photographs that seemed to mock her efforts. 16 years of Sofia's mother, Carmen, calling every anniversary to ask if there was any news, her voice growing smaller and more fragile with each passing year, until the calls stopped altogether 3 summers ago when cancer took her too. Azura's bare feet hit the cold tile floor of her modest ranch-style home, the chill shooting up through her bones as she fumbled for the lamp switch. The warm yellow light revealed walls covered with case files, newspaper clippings, and photographs, a shrine to the unsolved that had become her life's work. In the center of it all hung Sofia's school portrait, her gap-toothed smile frozen in time, innocent eyes that would never see graduation, never see her quinceañera, never see another sunrise over the Sonoran desert. The drive to the precinct passed in a blur of street lights and memories. Azura's hands gripped the steering wheel of her aging Ford Explorer, knuckles white against the black leather as she navigated the empty streets. The radio crackled with late-night dispatcher calls, domestic disturbances, break-ins, the endless cycle of human tragedy that kept rolling through Phoenix like tumbleweeds in a dust storm. But tonight was different. Tonight, after 16 years of chasing shadows, they had a name, they had a face. They had justice waiting in handcuffs. The Phoenix Police Department building loomed before her, its concrete facade lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast everything in stark, unforgiving angles. Azura had walked through these doors thousands of times, but tonight her legs felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. She pushed through the glass entrance, her reflection wavering for a moment in the surface. A woman of 53, silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, eyes that had seen too much but refused to look away. Lieutenant Rivera was waiting in the main corridor, his usually pristine uniform wrinkled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. His dark eyes met hers, and in them she saw the same mixture of triumph and exhaustion that she felt coursing through her own veins. "The lab called an hour ago," he said, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the detective bureau. "Perfect match on the DNA we pulled from Sofia's backpack, the sample we collected last month on that break-in on Camelback Road. Same perpetrator." "Who is he?" Azura's voice came out rougher than she intended, decades of cigarettes and desert air having taken their toll. "Thomas Whitmore, 47 years old, local contractor, been living in Scottsdale for the past 20 years. Clean record except for a few DUIs and that B&E last month that got his DNA in the system." Rivera paused at the door to the detective bureau, his hand resting on the handle. "Azura, there's something else. He's been living less than 5 miles from where Sofia was found, all this time." The words hit her like a physical blow. 5 miles? In a city of over 1 million people, spread across hundreds of square miles of desert, their killer had been hiding in plain sight, probably driving past the memorial gardens Sofia's community had built in her honor, probably shopping at the same grocery stores, pumping gas at the same stations, breathing the same air as the family he had destroyed. The detective bureau buzzed with unusual activity for the early morning hours. Officers and detectives clustered around desks, their voices low but charged with electricity. Everyone knew the Sofia Hernandez case. It had become legendary within the department, a cautionary tale about the cases that slip through your fingers and take pieces of your soul with them. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Detective James Chen looked up from his computer as they approached, his young face serious beyond his 32 years. He had been Azura's partner for the past 5 years, inheriting not just her desk assignments, but her obsessions, her late-night case reviews, her refusal to let the dead rest unremembered. "The arrest team is suiting up now," he said, standing to join them. "Whitmore is at his residence. Thermal imaging shows he's still in bed. We've got the house surrounded, but Lieutenant Rivera wanted to wait for you before we move in." Azura felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for 16 years. But beneath the relief was something else, a hollow ache, a recognition that this moment, as satisfying as it might be, could never bring back the 8-year-old girl who had trusted the wrong person on her walk home from school. "What about the family? Does Carmen's sister know?" Rivera's expression softened. "Maria's on her way. She should be here within the hour. Azura, she's been asking about you. Wants to be here when you bring him in." The mention of Maria Hernandez sent another wave of memory crashing over Azura. Sofia's aunt had become the keeper of her memory after Carmen's death, maintaining the small shrine in the family's backyard, organizing the annual memorial walk, never letting the community forget that somewhere out there, a monster walked free. Maria had aged decades in the past 3 years, her once vibrant spirit dimmed by grief and the weight of unanswered questions. "We need to do this right," Azura said, her voice steady now, the detective in her taking control. "By the book, no mistakes. This bastard isn't walking free on a technicality." The tactical team was already in position when Azura arrived at Thomas Whitmore's address, a modest, split-level home in a middle-class neighborhood where children's bicycles littered driveways and Halloween decorations still hung from front porches. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked, where a man like Thomas Whitmore could hide behind the facade of normalcy for 16 years. Azura stood behind the command vehicle, watching through binoculars as the house remained still and dark. Somewhere behind those walls was the man who had stolen Sofia Hernandez's future, who had ripped apart a family, who had haunted her dreams and driven her to the edge of obsession, the man who had made her question whether justice was real or just a word they painted on buildings and patrol cars. The radio crackled to life. "We're in position, awaiting your order." Lieutenant Rivera looked at Azura and she saw in his eyes a recognition of what this moment meant, not just for the case, but for her. This was her white whale, her impossible case, the one that had defined her career and consumed her life. "Detective Lane," he said formally, "would you like to give the order?" Azura lifted the radio to her lips, her hand surprisingly steady. In the distance, she could see the first hints of sunrise beginning to paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. The same sunrise Sofia would never see, but one that might finally bring some measure of peace to those who loved her. "Move in," she said. The words had barely left her lips when the tactical team surged forward, their movements precise and coordinated. Within moments, they had breached the front door, their shouts of "Police! Search warrant!" echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Lights began flickering on in nearby houses as residents stirred, drawn to their windows by the sudden commotion. And then silence. Long, terrible moments of silence that stretched like taffy in the desert heat, until finally the radio crackled again. "Suspect in custody. No resistance."
Azura closed her eyes and felt 16 years of weight lifting from her shoulders like morning mist evaporating in the sun. But even as relief flooded through her, she knew that this was just the beginning. The arrest was only the first step in a journey that would take them through courtrooms and testimony, through lawyers and appeals, through a media circus that would inevitably reduce Sofia to headlines and sound bites. But for now, in this moment, standing in a Scottsdale driveway as the sun painted the sky the color of hope, Detective Azura Lane allowed herself to believe that sometimes the good guys do win, that sometimes the monsters are caught, and that sometimes the dead do get their justice. The question that haunted her, though, as she watched Thomas Whitmore being loaded into the back of a patrol car, was whether 16 years of freedom had been enough time for him to create other victims, other families torn apart by unspeakable loss, and whether this victory, as sweet as it tasted, was really an ending or just the beginning of an even darker truth. Azura Lane had never planned to become the department's ghost hunter, the detective who specialized in cases where the living had failed the dead. 28 years earlier, fresh out of the police academy with idealistic dreams and a newly minted badge, she had envisioned a career chasing down active criminals, solving cases within weeks, bringing closure to families while memories were still fresh and hope still burned bright. But life, she had learned, rarely followed the neat narrative arcs of television procedurals. The morning after Thomas Whitmore's arrest found Azura in her usual spot, the corner booth at Rosita's Diner on McDowell Road, where she had eaten breakfast almost every day for the past 15 years. The red vinyl seats had molded themselves to her body over time, and Maria, the owner's daughter, knew to bring her coffee black and strong, with 2 pieces of wheat toast, no butter. "You look different today, Detective," Maria said, setting down the steaming mug. "Like you finally got some sleep." Azura managed a tired smile. Sleep had remained elusive, even after the arrest. Her body might have been exhausted, but her mind continued racing, replaying every detail of the case, every missed connection, every moment when they might have caught Whitmore sooner if only she had been smarter, faster, more intuitive. "Big case closed last night," she said, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic mug. 16 years in the making. Maria's eyes widened. The little girl, Sofia Hernandez? News traveled fast in Phoenix, especially news about cases that had captured the city's heart and refused to let go. Azura nodded, watching as Maria's expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, a recognition of what this meant not just for Sofia's family, but for the detective who had carried her memory like a stone in her chest for 16 years. "Carmen would have been so proud," Maria whispered, and Azura felt her throat tighten at the mention of Sofia's mother. The diner was filling with the usual morning crowd, construction workers grabbing coffee before heading to job sites, office workers in rumpled business clothes stealing a few extra minutes before facing their cubicles, retirees who came for the company as much as the food. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that just hours before, one of the monsters who had walked among them for 16 years had finally been caged. Azura's phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Chen. "Press conference at 10 a.m. Rivera wants you front and center." The thought of facing reporters, of having cameras and microphones thrust in her face while she tried to explain 16 years of failure, followed by one night of success, made her stomach clench. She has always preferred working in the shadows, letting the evidence speak rather than her own words. Public speaking was Lieutenant Rivera's strength, not hers. But this was Sofia's moment. If standing in front of cameras helped ensure that Thomas Whitmore stayed behind bars, if it brought some measure of comfort to the community that never stopped hoping for justice, then she would find the courage to speak. Her phone rang, an unknown number with a local area code. "Detective Lane? This is Rebecca Martinez from Channel 12 News. I was hoping I could get a statement from you about the arrest in the Sofia Hernandez case." The vultures were already circling. Azura had seen this dance before. The media frenzy that inevitably followed high-profile arrests. The way reporters would dissect every detail of Sofia's life and death. The way they would turn tragedy into entertainment. She declined the interview politely but firmly, knowing that a dozen more calls would follow. After breakfast, she drove to Desert Memorial Cemetery, where Sofia had been laid to rest 16 years earlier in a small plot beneath a mesquite tree. The headstone was simple, pink granite with an etching of sunflowers and the words, "Our little angel, taken too soon." Someone, probably Maria Hernandez, had left fresh flowers the day before, yellow roses and baby's breath arranged in a small vase. Azura knelt beside the grave, her knees protesting against the hard, packed earth. She had come here countless times over the years, especially on the difficult days when leads dried up and hope seemed as distant as rain in the desert. Sometimes she'd talk to Sofia, updating her on the investigation, promising that she wouldn't give up. Other times, she simply sat in silence, letting the weight of responsibility settle over her like a familiar blanket. "We got him, mija," she whispered, using the Spanish endearment Sofia's mother had always favored. "It took too long, but we got him." The morning breeze rustled through the mesquite leaves, and for a moment Azura allowed herself to imagine that it was Sofia's way of saying thank you. She knew it was fanciful thinking, the kind of magical reasoning that had no place in police work, but after 16 years of carrying the dead, she had learned that sometimes the heart needed what the mind couldn't provide. Her radio crackled to life, interrupting her thoughts. "All units, be advised we have a 211 in progress at the Circle K on 32nd Street and Thomas Road. Suspect is armed and dangerous." Azura instinctively reached for her radio, ready to respond, but then caught herself. She was off-duty, technically, and Rivera had made it clear that she needed to be at the station for the press conference. But old habits die hard, and the detective in her wanted to be where the action was, wanted to be chasing down the living criminals instead of communing with the dead. Instead, she stood slowly, her joints stiff from the cool morning air, and made her way back to her Explorer. The drive to the station took her through neighborhoods she knew intimately, not from living in them, but from investigating them. The apartment complex where a domestic violence case had turned deadly 3 years ago, the strip mall where a teenager had been gunned down over a pair of sneakers, the elementary school where a crossing guard had been struck by a drunk driver and never walked again. Every street corner held a story. Every intersection had witnessed something that brought it to her attention. After nearly 30 decades on the force, Azura had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of Phoenix's pain points, its vulnerable areas, its recurring nightmares. She could drive blindfolded through the city and still tell you which blocks were most likely to generate calls, which intersections saw the most accidents, which schools dealt with the most violence. It was a depressing superpower, this intimate familiarity with human suffering. But it was also what made her good at her job, the ability to see patterns where others saw random events, to understand the rhythms of violence and desperation that pulsed through urban life like a second heartbeat. The Phoenix Police Department was buzzing with more activity than usual when she arrived. Word of the arrest had spread through the building like wildfire, and she found herself receiving congratulations from officers she barely knew, handshakes from detectives and other units, nods of respect from command staff who had watched her pursue the case long after others had given up. Detective Chen was waiting at her desk with a stack of paperwork and a grim expression. "The media circus has officially begun," he said, gesturing toward the front of the building where news vans were already setting up. Channel 3, Channel 12, Fox News, even some national outlets. Rivera's fielding calls from CNN and Nancy Grace. Oh, groan.
"What about Whitmore? How's he handling custody?" "Lawyered up immediately. Public Defender's Office assigned Patricia Gonzalez. She's good. This won't be a slam dunk, Azura. Even with the DNA, she'll find ways to create reasonable doubt." The reminder sobered her. The arrest was just the beginning. Conviction required a whole different set of skills, a different kind of battle fought in courtrooms instead of crime scenes. Defense attorneys were paid to tear apart cases that look airtight, to find the procedural errors, the contaminated evidence, the witness testimonies that could be discredited. What about his background? Anything that connects him to other cases? Chen flipped through a thick file. We're running his DNA against CODIS, checking for matches in other jurisdictions. Employment records show he worked obstruction jobs all over the valley between 2005 and 2010. Plenty of opportunities to encounter other potential victims. The thought sent a chill through Azura's spine. Serial predators rarely stopped at one victim, especially when they got away with it for 16 years. There could be other families out there, other mothers who died without knowing what happened to their children, other cases that had gone cold while the perpetrator walked free. I want a timeline of every job site he worked, every place he lived, every school district, every park, every place where he might have encountered children, she said, her voice taking on the focused intensity that her colleagues had learned to recognize. And I want to talk to him. Chen raised an eyebrows. His lawyer will never allow it. Then we don't ask the lawyer. We request an interview, see if his ego is bigger than his common sense. Guys like Whitmore, they want to be the smartest person in the room. They want to explain themselves, to justify what they did, to prove they're not the monsters everyone thinks they are. It was a long shot, but Azura had built her career on long shots, on the cases other detectives had written off as unsolvable. She understood predators in a way that made her colleagues uncomfortable sometimes, not because she sympathized with them, but because she had spent so many years thinking like them, anticipating their moves, trying to understand the twisted logic that drove them to destroy innocent lives. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp, giving her just enough time to review the case file one more time, to prepare answers for questions she hoped the reporters wouldn't ask, but she knew they would. Rivera had already briefed her on what she could and couldn't discuss. Pending legal proceedings meant that most of the interesting details would have to remain confidential, leaving her to speak in the kind of vague platitudes that frustrated everyone involved. At 9:45, she made her way to the front of the building, where a small podium had been set up on the steps. The crowd of reporters was larger than she had expected, with camera crews from local stations jockeying for the best angles and print reporters checking their recording devices. She recognized several faces from previous press conferences, crime beat reporters who had covered dozens of similar events, their expressions professional but weary. Lieutenant Rivera appeared at her elbow, his uniform crisp and his expression confident. He had the politician's gift for looking comfortable under camera lights, for delivering sound bites that satisfied the media without compromising ongoing investigations. "You ready for this?" he asked quietly. Azura straightened her shoulders and adjusted her blazer. "As ready as I'll ever be." The questions came fast and predictable. How long had Whitmore been a suspect? What led to his arrest? Were there other victims? What did this mean for the Hernandez family? Azura answered as best she could, sticking to the facts, refusing to speculate, deflecting the more sensational questions with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to navigate media attention without falling into its traps. But then a reporter in the back raised her hand, and the question she asked made Azura's blood run cold. "Detective Lane, you've been working this case for 16 years. Some people are wondering why it took so long to catch someone who was living just 5 miles from the crime scene. Do you think the investigation could have been handled differently?"
The implication was clear, and it cut deeper than any physical wound. For 16 years, while Thomas Whitmore lived his normal life, went to work, paid his taxes, maybe even coached Little League or volunteered at church, Sofia Hernandez remained dead, and her killer remained free. For 16 years, every birthday he celebrated was one Sofia would never have. Every Christmas morning he woke up in his own bed was another reminder that justice delayed was justice denied. Azura looked directly at the reporter, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. This investigation never stopped. Every lead was followed, every piece of evidence was analyzed, every possible suspect was interviewed. Sometimes justice takes time, but it never goes away. Thomas Whitmore thought he had gotten away with murder, but he was wrong. Sofia Hernandez was never forgotten, not for a single day, and now her killer will face the consequences of what he did. The words were true, but they felt insufficient, like trying to fill the Grand Canyon with a bucket of water.
Nothing she said could give Sofia back her life, could give Carmen back her daughter, could restore the 16 years that had been stolen from all of them. As the press conference ended and the reporters dispersed, Azura remained on the steps, watching the circus pack up and move on to the next story. Tomorrow there would be other crimes, other victims, other families torn apart by violence. The cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would. But for now, in this moment, she had given Sofia Hernandez something that had been denied to her for 16 years, a voice that refused to be silenced, a champion who would never stop fighting, and the promise that sometimes, just sometimes, the monsters don't win. The question that haunted her now was whether she had the strength to do it all over again for the next case, the next victim, the next family destroyed by evil masquerading as ordinary. Because she knew, with the certainty that came from 3 decades of police work, that there would always be a next time. The 3 days following Thomas Whitmore's arrest passed in a whirlwind of bureaucratic chaos and media attention that threatened to overshadow the very case it was meant to illuminate. Azura found herself caught between the relentless demands of reporters seeking exclusive angles and the methodical requirements of building an airtight prosecution case. But it was on Thursday afternoon, while reviewing Whitmore's employment records in the cramped confines of her office, that the first crack in their seemingly solid case began to show. Detective Chen burst through her office door without knocking, his usually composed demeanor shattered by whatever he had discovered. In his hands were 2 manila folders, their edges worn from handling, and his eyes held the kind of wild excitement that came from uncovering something that changed everything. "Azura, we've got a problem," he said, dropping heavily into the chair across from her desk. "I've been cross-referencing Whitmore's employment history with unsolved cases from 2005 to 2015 like you asked." And she looked up from the timeline she had been constructing, noting the tension in her partner's voice. "I found connections to 4 other cases, 4 missing children, all between the ages of 7 and 10, within a 20-mile radius of construction sites where Whitmore was working." Chen opened the first folder, revealing photographs that made Azura's stomach clench. Jessica Martinez, age 9, disappeared from a playground in Tempe in 2006. Timothy Rodriguez, age 8, vanished from his backyard in Mesa in 2008. Angela Foster, 10 years old, never made it home from school in Glendale in 2010. And Marcus Williams, 7, disappeared from a birthday party in Chandler in 2012. Azura felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling over her shoulders like lead armor. 4 more children. 4 more families destroyed, 4 more cases where she had failed to see the connection, failed to recognize the pattern, failed to catch a predator before he struck again.
"Were any of these cases ever connected?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from Chen's expression. Different jurisdictions, different lead detectives, different MOs. Jessica was assumed to be a runaway, troubled home life, history of acting out. Timothy's family was going through a bitter custody battle, so everyone assumed the father had taken him. Angela's case got the most attention, but it went cold within 6 months. Marcus's disappearance was initially treated as a possible drowning. The party was near a canal. Each name was another weight added to Azura's conscience, another sleepless night waiting to happen. She had dedicated her career to speaking for the voiceless, to ensuring that no victim was forgotten, no family abandoned. But now she was faced with the possibility that her 16-year obsession with Sofia Hernandez had blinded her to other children who needed her voice just as desperately. "Bodies?" she asked quietly. "Never found. All 5 cases remain open missing persons files." The implications were staggering. If Thomas Whitmore was responsible for these disappearances, and the circumstantial evidence was compelling, then his crime spree had lasted at least 6 years, possibly longer. 5 families had been living in limbo, clinging to hope that their children might still be alive, while the man responsible lived freely in Scottsdale, probably driving past missing child posters with their faces on them. "I need to talk to him," Azura said, pushing back from her desk with sudden determination. "Now." His lawyer shut down any interview requests yesterday. Patricia Gonzalez isn't stupid. She knows that anything he says will only make the case against him stronger. "Then we approach this differently. What about the families? Have you reached out to them yet?" I wanted to talk to you first. Azura, if we're wrong about this, if we give these families false hope and then dash it again." She understood his concern. Hope was a dangerous drug for families of missing children. It could sustain them through years of uncertainty, but it could also destroy them if wielded carelessly. These parents had already endured years of wondering, of checking every missing child database, of seeing their children's faces in crowds that turned out to be strangers. "We approach it carefully," she said finally. "We present it as a possible connection, not a certainty. We let them know that we're investigating, that their children haven't been forgotten." The first call was to Elena Martinez, Jessica's mother. Azura had learned over the years that delivering difficult news required a delicate balance of honesty and compassion, of providing enough information to be helpful without creating false expectations. Elena's voice when she answered carried the weary caution of someone who had received too many phone calls that led nowhere. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Detective Azura Lane with the Phoenix Police Department. I'm calling about Jessica's case." The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line was audible. Is there news? "We've arrested a suspect in another child's disappearance, and we believe there may be a connection to Jessica's case. I'd like to meet with you, if you're willing, to discuss what we know." The silence stretched for nearly 10 seconds before Elena's voice returned, smaller and more fragile than before. "After 18 years, you think you know what happened to my little girl?" "I think we might have some answers, but I don't want to discuss this over the phone. Would you be available to meet this evening?" Elena Martinez lived in the same house from which her daughter had disappeared 18 years earlier, a small ranch-style home in a working-class neighborhood where the American dream had been deferred but never abandoned. The front yard was meticulously maintained with desert landscaping that required little water but maximum attention to detail. Wind chimes hung from the covered porch, their gentle music providing a soundtrack of memory and longing. When Elena opened the door, Azura was struck by how much she resembled the photographs from Jessica's case file. The same high cheekbones, the same expressive brown eyes, the same small stature. But 18 years of wondering had carved lines around those eyes and added silver threads to hair that had once been uniformly black. "Detective Lane," she said, extending a hand that trembled slightly. "Thank you for coming. Please come in." The living room was a shrine to Jessica Martinez. Photographs covered every available surface, from her first steps to her last school picture. Her bedroom, Elena explained, remained exactly as she had left it 18 years ago. Clothes still hanging in the closet, stuffed animals still arranged on the bed, homework still spread across a small desk beneath a window that faced the playground where she had disappeared. "I know it's not healthy," Elena said, settling into a worn recliner that faced the largest photograph, a professional portrait taken just months before Jessica vanished. "My husband, he wanted to move years ago, said staying here was like living in a tomb, but I couldn't leave. What if she came home? What if she was looking for us?" Azura had heard similar stories hundreds of times. Families frozen in time by tragedy, unable to move forward, but equally unable to let go. She explained about Thomas Whitmore's arrest, about the DNA evidence that connected him to Sofia Hernandez's murder, about the employment records that placed him near the playground where Jessica had last been seen. "So you think he killed my baby too?" Elena's voice was steady, but tears traced silent paths down her cheeks. "I think it's possible. The timing, the location, the victim profile, there are significant similarities. But I want you to understand that right now, we don't have any physical evidence connecting him to Jessica's disappearance. This is still an investigation." Elena nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving Jessica's photograph. "You know what the hardest part is, Detective? It's not knowing. For 18 years, I've wondered if she's out there somewhere, if she's alive, if she's thinking about home. I've imagined her growing up, getting married, having children of her own. And I've also imagined the worst, that she suffered, that she was afraid, that she called for me and I couldn't hear her." The words hit Azura like physical blows, each one a reminder of the stakes involved in her work. Every case was more than just evidence and procedure. It was someone's entire world shattered into pieces that might never fit back together. "If this man took my Jessica, if he hurt her, then I want him to pay. But more than that, I want to know what happened to her. I want to be able to visit her grave, to have a place where I can go to talk to her. Does that make sense?" It made perfect sense. Azura had seen it countless times. Families who needed closure more than they needed justice, who would rather have their worst fears confirmed than continue living in uncertainty. The not knowing was its own form of torture, a wound that could never heal because it was constantly being reopened by hope and possibility. The meeting with Timothy Rodriguez's parents was more difficult. Carmen and Miguel Rodriguez had divorced 6 years after their son's disappearance, their marriage another casualty of unspeakable loss. They met at the police station separately, unable to be in the same room without the weight of shared grief threatening to crush both of them. Carmen arrived first, a woman in her early 50s who moved with careful precision of someone who had learned to hold herself together through sheer force of will. She worked as a school nurse now, she explained, because being around children helped her feel closer to the son she had lost. Timothy would be 23 now, she said, staring at a photograph of a gap-toothed 8-year-old. "I used to calculate his age every year on his birthday. I'd imagined what he would look like, what he would be doing. But I stopped a few years ago. It was too painful."
Miguel arrived 20 minutes later, his appearance disheveled and his eyes red-rimmed in a way that suggested his coping mechanisms had been less healthy than his ex-wife's. He worked in construction now, he said, moving from job to job, never staying in one place long enough to form attachments that might break his heart again. "I blamed myself for years," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "We were going through the custody battle, and I thought maybe if I hadn't been fighting Carmen, if I had been home more, if I had been a better father." "This isn't about what you did or didn't do," Azura said gently. "This is about a predator who targeted children. If Thomas Whitmore is responsible for Timothy's disappearance, then he's the only one to blame." The pattern that emerged from talking to the families was heartbreaking in its consistency. Each child had been taken from a location where they should have been safe: a playground, a backyard, a school route they had traveled dozens of times before. Each family had been left to wonder, to blame themselves, to construct elaborate fantasies about what might have happened and whether their child was still alive. But it was the meeting with Angela Foster's mother that proved to be the most challenging. Sarah Foster had remarried 3 years after her daughter's disappearance, and her new husband had made it clear that he didn't want constant reminders of her previous life cluttering their fresh start. Angela's photographs had been relegated to a single album, stored in a closet with other memories deemed too painful for public display. "I had to choose," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper as they sat in her immaculate living room, "between honoring my dead daughter and building a life with my living family, between being Angela's mother and being David's wife and stepmother to his children." The choice had cost her dearly. The guilt of moving on had eaten away at her like acid, creating a distance between herself and the memory of her lost child that felt like a second abandonment. She showed Azura to a guest bedroom where she kept Angela's things: clothes that would never fit, toys that would never be played with, school papers that chronicled a life cut short at 10 years old. "I still dream about her," Sarah confided. "She comes to me sometimes, asking why I stopped looking for her, why I let myself be happy again. I tell her it's not that I stopped loving her, It's that I had to learn to live with the pain instead of letting it kill me. The conversation with Marcus Williams's parents was the most devastating of all. His father, Robert, had died by suicide 4 years after his son's disappearance, unable to bear the weight of wondering and waiting. His mother, Patricia, now lived in an assisted living facility, her mind fractured by grief and early-onset dementia that made it impossible for her to understand that her 7-year-old son would never walk through the door asking what was for dinner. She still sets a place for him at Christmas, the facility's social worker explained as they walked through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and defeat. She still buys him birthday presents. We tried to explain that he's been gone for 12 years, but it only causes her more distress. Patricia Williams sat in a wheelchair by a window that looked out onto a courtyard where other residents walked slowly along paved paths. When Azura approached her, introducing herself as a police officer investigating Marcus's case, Patricia's eyes lit up with the hope that was heartbreaking to witness. "Have you found my boy?" she asked, her voice carrying the eager anticipation of someone who had asked the same question thousands of times. "Is he coming home?" Azura couldn't bring herself to explain about Thomas Whitmore, about DNA evidence and criminal patterns and the likelihood that Marcus had been dead for 12 years. Instead, she simply held Patricia's hand and promised that Marcus was not forgotten, that people were still looking for him, that he was loved. The weight of these conversations settled over Azura like a blanket soaked in sorrow. 4 families destroyed by one man's evil. 4 sets of parents who had spent years wondering if they could have done something different, if they could have protected their children better, if their love had been enough to keep their babies safe.
But it was when she returned to the station that evening that the case took another devastating turn. Chen was waiting for her with news that made her blood run cold. "I got a call from Patricia Gonzalez, Whitmore's lawyer," he said grimly. "She wants to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" "Information about the other children in exchange for life without parole instead of the death penalty." The words hung in the air between them like a poisonous cloud. If Whitmore was willing to bargain with information about other victims, it could only mean one thing. He knew where the bodies were because he had put them there. 5 children, dead by his hand. Their families left to wonder and hope while their killer walked free for years. What does the DA's office say? "They're considering it. 5 families deserve to know what happened to their children, to have somewhere to visit, somewhere to grieve properly. But it would mean Whitmore escapes the ultimate punishment for what he did." Azura felt sick to her stomach. The thought of Thomas Whitmore living out his days in a prison cell, possibly writing memoirs or giving interviews, possibly becoming some twisted celebrity among other killers, while Sofia and Jessica and Timothy and Angela and Marcus remained forever young in death, was almost unbearable. "I need to talk to the families first," she said finally. "This decision affects them more than anyone else." The phone calls were agonizing. Each family deserved to know that closure was possible, but it would come at the price of allowing their children's killer to avoid the death chamber. The responses varied as much as the personalities involved. Alana Martinez was adamant. "I want to bury my daughter. I want to hold her one last time, even if it's just her bones. Let him live if it means I can finally bring Jessica home." Carmen Rodriguez was torn. "Timothy deserves justice, but he also deserves a proper burial. I don't know how to choose between revenge and peace." Sarah Foster was conflicted in a different way. "I've already made one terrible choice between my daughter's memory and my own survival. I can't make another one." Patricia Williams, lost in the fog of dementia, couldn't comprehend the choice at all, leaving the decision to a social worker who had never known Marcus but understood the importance of bringing him home. The media, when they caught wind of the potential deal, erupted in a feeding frenzy of speculation and outrage. Talk radio hosts denounced the negotiations as surrender to evil. Victims' rights groups organized protests outside the courthouse. Online forums buzzed with armchair legal experts debating the ethics of bargaining with a child killer. But it was Sofia's aunt, Maria Hernandez, who provided the perspective that cut through all the noise and controversy. "Sofia is already at rest," she said quietly, sitting in Azura's office with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "She's with her mother now, and Carmen has the answers she spent 16 years looking for. But those other mothers, they're still waiting. They're still hoping. If this monster can give them peace, if he can tell them where their babies are, then maybe some good can come from all this evil." The decision ultimately rested with the district attorney's office, but Azura knew that her recommendation would carry significant weight. She had spent 16 years building credibility within the system, earning respect for her thoroughness and dedication. People listened when she spoke about cases involving children. She spent a sleepless night walking through her empty house, past the walls covered with case files and victim photographs, trying to weigh justice against closure, punishment against peace. And in the end, it was Sofia's school portrait that provided the answer. Those innocent eyes that would never see another sunrise, that gap-toothed smile that had been silenced forever.
"If it were my daughter," she whispered to the photograph, "I would want to bring her home." The next morning, she called District Attorney Rebecca Walsh and gave her recommendation: accept the deal. Thomas Whitmore would plead guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder in exchange for revealing the locations of his victims' remains and accepting life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. Some praised it as a compassionate decision that prioritized the family's need for closure. Others condemned it as a betrayal of justice, a surrender to evil that set a dangerous precedent for future cases. But for Azura, standing at the podium for another press conference she didn't want to give, the criticism was irrelevant. What mattered was that 5 families would finally have answers. 5 sets of remains would receive proper burials, and 5 young souls would finally be able to rest in peace. This was not an easy decision, she told the assembled reporters, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. But it was the right decision. These families have suffered enough. They deserve to know what happened to their children, and they deserve to be able to say goodbye properly. The questions came fast and harsh. Don't you think you're rewarding a child killer? What message does this send to other predators? How can you look at Sofia's family and tell them her killer won't face the ultimate punishment? Azura answered each one with the patience of someone who had learned to navigate controversy without losing her moral compass. But it was the final question that hit hardest. Detective Lane, you've spent 16 years on this case. Do you feel like this deal represents success or failure? She looked out at the sea of cameras and microphones, at the reporters who would reduce this moment to sound bites and headlines, at a world that demanded simple answers to impossibly complex questions. Success isn't measured by the punishment we inflict on the guilty, she said finally. It's measured by the peace we can bring to the innocent. 5 families will finally have their children home. That's not failure, that's grace. But even as she spoke the words, Azura knew that the real test of her decision was yet to come. Thomas Whitmore would have to make good on his promise. He would have to lead them to the places where 5 young lives had ended, where 5 futures had been buried in shallow graves or hidden in remote corners of the Arizona desert. And she would have to find the strength to stand witness to the aftermath of 16 years of evil, to help families say goodbye to children who should have lived to see their own children grow up, to ensure that the dead finally received the dignity and respect that had been stolen from them in life. The hardest part, she realized, was yet to come. Because bringing the children home was only the beginning of a healing that would take generations to complete, if it ever could be completed at all. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning Thomas Whitmore was scheduled to reveal the locations of his victims' remains, Azura arrived at the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office before dawn. The desert sky was painted in shades of purple and gold, the same colors that had welcomed her to Phoenix 30 years ago, when she was young and idealistic and believed that good always triumphed over evil. Now, with silver threading through her dark hair and lines etched around her eyes by decades of witnessing humanity's capacity for cruelty, she understood that sometimes victory came at a cost that felt almost as heavy as defeat. The conference room was already crowded when she entered. District Attorney Rebecca Walsh sat at the head of the table, her expression grim but determined. Patricia Gonzalez, Whitmore's defense attorney, occupied the chair beside her, surrounded by legal documents and case files that represented months of careful negotiation. FBI agents from the Behavioral Analysis Unit had flown in from Quantico, their expertise in serial crime patterns requested by the local authorities who understood they were dealing with something beyond their usual experience.
But it was the presence of the victim's family members that made the room feel charged with emotion. So thick, it was almost suffocating. Elena Martinez sat rigidly upright, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the far wall. Carmen Rodriguez clutched a rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer. Sarah Foster had brought her current husband for support, though his discomfort with the situation was evident in every tense line of his body. A social worker from the assisted living facility represented Patricia Williams' interests, since Marcus's mother was no longer capable of understanding the proceedings. And in the corner, almost invisible in her black dress and mantilla, sat Maria Hernandez, Sofia's aunt. She had insisted on being present, she explained to Azura, because someone from Sofia's family needed to witness this moment to ensure that their little girl was not forgotten in the midst of revelations about the other victims. "Before we bring Mr. Whitmore in," District Attorney Walsh began, her voice carefully modulated to convey both authority and compassion, "I want to make sure everyone understands what's going to happen today. Mr. Whitmore has agreed to provide detailed information about the locations where the victim's remains can be found. This information will be recorded and used to guide recovery operations. However, some of what he says may be difficult to hear. The details of what happened to these children will likely be disturbing." Elena Martinez spoke first, her voice steady but strained. "I've imagined the worst for 18 years, Ms. Walsh. Nothing he says can be worse than the nightmares I've already lived with." Carmen Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "We need to know. These families, we've been trapped between hope and despair for so long. Whatever he tells us, at least it will be the truth." The door to the conference room opened, and Thomas Whitmore entered flanked by 2 corrections officers. Azura's first glimpse of him up close was jarring. He looked so ordinary, so unremarkable, that it seemed impossible he could be responsible for so much devastation. Medium height, graying brown hair, soft features that suggested a man who enjoyed his meals and his comfort. He could have been anyone's neighbor, anyone's coworker, anyone's friendly contractor who showed up to fix their roof and complimented them on their garden. But it was his eyes that gave him away. When Whitmore looked around the room, taking in the assembled families and officials, there was something cold and calculating in his gaze, a complete absence of the empathy that marked most human interactions. He was studying them, Azura realized, gauging their reactions, perhaps even taking some form of perverse pleasure in being the center of so much attention and anguish. "Good morning," he said, pleasantly, as if he were greeting colleagues at a business meeting rather than addressing the families of children he had murdered. "I understand you want to know about the little ones." The casual reference to his victims as the little ones sent a chill through the room. Several of the family members visibly recoiled, and Maria Hernandez made a soft sound of distress that cut through Azura's heart like a blade. Patricia Gonzalez leaned forward. "Mr. Whitmore, as we discussed, you're here to provide information about the locations of the victim's remains in accordance with your plea agreement. Please be specific and accurate in your descriptions." Whitmore nodded, settling back in his chair with the air of someone preparing to tell a story he had rehearsed in his head many times. "I remember each one," he said, his voice ticking on an almost nostalgic quality. "They were all so different, but they had something in common. They trusted too easily. They believed the world was a safe place." "Start with Jessica Martinez," the district attorney instructed, her voice cutting through Whitmore's philosophical musings. "Where is she?" Elena Martinez gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white with tension, as Whitmore turned his attention to her. For a moment, he simply stared, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that he was enjoying Elena's anguish, feeding off it like some emotional vampire. "Jessica," he said, finally, "was the first. I was working on a shopping center renovation in Tempe, and I used to see her at the playground during my lunch breaks. Such a pretty little girl, with those dark curls and that bright smile. She reminded me of my sister when she was young." "Where is she?" Elena's voice cracked on the words, but her gaze never wavered from Whitmore's face.
"I took her to a construction site I was working on weekends, about 15 miles north of Cave Creek. There was a foundation being poured for a new subdivision that never got built. The developer went bankrupt 6 months later. I buried her there, under what was supposed to become someone's dream home." The specific details hit Elena like physical blows. Azura watched as the woman who had maintained her composure through 18 years of uncertainty finally broke, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. The social worker beside her provided tissues and quiet comfort, but nothing could ease the pain of finally knowing that hope had been futile, that her daughter had been dead all along. "Timothy Rodriguez," District Attorney Walsh continued, consulting her notes. "Where is his body?" Carmen Rodriguez's rosary beads clicked together more rapidly as Whitmore turned his attention to her family's tragedy. "Timothy was more challenging," he said, as if discussing a difficult crossword puzzle rather than the murder of an 8-year-old boy. "He was suspicious from the beginning, kept asking questions. Smart kid. Too smart." The backhanded compliment made Carmen flinch. Miguel Rodriguez, Timothy's father, hadn't spoken since entering the room, but now he leaned forward with murder in his eyes. "Where is my son, you piece of—" "Mr. Rodriguez," Patricia Gonzalez interrupted smoothly. "Please allow my client to provide the information you came here to receive." Whitmore seemed amused by Miguel's outburst. "Timothy is in South Mountain Park, near one of the old mining claims. I used to hike there on weekends, knew all the abandoned shafts and hidden caves. He's in a place where the desert flowers bloom every spring, where he can watch the sunrise over the valley." The poetic description of Timothy's gravesite was grotesque in its incongruity, as if Whitmore was trying to romanticize the horror he had inflicted. Carmen's sobs joined Elena's, creating a soundtrack of grief that filled the conference room like poisonous gas. "Angela Foster," the district attorney pressed on relentlessly. Sarah Foster had gone pale as parchment, her husband's arm around her shoulders, providing the only thing keeping her upright. "Angela was the most trusting," Whitmore said, his voice taking on that same nostalgic quality. "She actually got in my truck willingly, thought I was giving her a ride home from school. She told me about her pet hamster, about the book report she was supposed to turn in the next day, about how her mother made the best chocolate chip cookies in the world." Sarah Foster made a sound like she was drowning, and her husband tightened his grip on her shoulders. "Please," he whispered, "just tell us where she is." "Lake Pleasant.
There's a cove on the north side where I used to take my boat sometimes. The water's deep there, even during the dry seasons. She's been sleeping under the water for 13 years now. The revelation that Angela's body was in Lake Pleasant, beneath waters where families picnicked and children played, added another layer of horror to an already unbearable situation. Azura found herself thinking of all the times she had driven past the lake, all the summer afternoons when Phoenix residents flocked there to escape the heat, never knowing that a child's grave lay beneath the surface. Marcus Williams, District Attorney Walsh's voice was getting hoarser with each name, the emotional toll of the proceedings affecting even the seasoned prosecutor. This time, Whitmore paused longer before answering, his eyes taking on a distant quality that suggested he was reliving the memory in vivid detail. Marcus was the youngest, 7 years old, afraid of his own shadow, but too polite to run away from a grown-up who said he needed help finding a lost puppy.
The social worker representing Patricia Williams took careful notes, knowing she would have to somehow explain to a woman with dementia that her son's body had been found, that the waiting was finally over. He's in the Superstition Mountains, in one of the old Apache caves. The entrance is hidden by Palo Verde trees and desert sage. You'd never find it unless you knew exactly where to look. I chose that place because it seemed peaceful, sacred almost. The Apache believed the mountains were where spirits went to rest. The appropriation of Native American spiritual beliefs to justify his crimes added yet another layer of revulsion to Whitmore's confession. Azura felt sick to her stomach watching this monster try to frame his horrific actions as somehow meaningful or respectful. "And Sofia Hernandez?" District Attorney Walsh asked, though they already knew where Sofia's body had been found 16 years earlier. "Sofia was different," Whitmore said, his tone shifting slightly. "She fought back. Bit me, actually. I still have the scar." He held up his left hand, showing a small white mark on his thumb. "She was the only one who drew blood. I think that's why I left her where she could be found, why I didn't hide her as well as the others. Some part of me knew she deserved better." Maria Hernandez stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. "She deserved to live," she said, her voice thick with accent and anger. "They all deserve to live. You took their lives, their futures, their family's happiness. You don't get to decide what they deserved." Whitmore looked at Maria with what might have been surprise, as if he had genuinely expected gratitude for his twisted logic. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said, the first hint of what could have been remorse creeping into his voice. "It wasn't supposed to go as far as it did." "Then why did you keep doing it?" Elena Martinez had found her voice again, her grief temporarily overwhelmed by fury. "If you didn't mean for it to happen, why didn't you stop after Jessica? Why did you take 4 more children from their families?" For the first time since entering the room, Whitmore seemed to struggle for words. His carefully constructed facade of calm control cracked slightly, revealing something darker underneath. "I don't know," he said finally. "After Jessica, I thought about turning myself in, but then I realized I felt different, powerful, like I had discovered something about myself that I never knew was there. And the more time that passed, the easier it became to tell myself that it wasn't really my fault, that they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time." The psychological insight into Whitmore's evolution from opportunistic predator to serial killer was fascinating from a forensic perspective, but devastating for the families who had to listen to him describe their children as catalysts for his self-discovery. District Attorney Walsh consulted her notes one final time. "Mr. Whitmore, is there anything else you need to tell us? Any other victims we should know about?" The question hung in the air like a sword of Damocles. Everyone in the room understood the implication. If there were other children, other families who had been destroyed by this monster, this might be their only chance to find out. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving around the room as if he were calculating something. When he finally spoke, his words sent a chill through everyone present. There was one more, before Jessica. But that one was different. That one was an accident. The revelation that there had been a sixth victim, someone who had died before Whitmore began his systematic predation, opened up new questions that nobody in the room was prepared to handle. How many more secrets was he hiding? How many more families were out there wondering what had happened to their missing children? Who? District Attorney Walsh demanded, though Azura could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the recognition that this case was far more complicated than they had imagined. A little boy in Tucson, 2003. Danny something. I was working on a house renovation and he wandered into the construction zone. There was an accident with some machinery, and when I realized he was dead, I panicked. Buried him in the backyard of the house I was working on. The owners probably built their patio right over him.
The casual way Whitmore described what was supposedly an accidental death made Azura's skin crawl. Even if the initial incident had been unintentional, the decision to hide the body, to rob a family of closure, to let them spend years wondering what had happened to their child, was an act of profound evil. What was his last name? She found herself asking, her detective's instincts taking over despite the emotional chaos surrounding them. I don't know, Whitmore shrugged. He was just a kid who wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. I never knew his name. The dismissive response crystallized something in Azura's mind, a recognition that Thomas Whitmore was not just a killer, but someone who fundamentally failed to see his victims as human beings. To him, they were objects, sources of power or inconvenience, but never children with names and families and futures that mattered. As the formal proceedings concluded and Whitmore was led back to his cell, the families were left to grapple with the devastating knowledge they had sought for so many years. The room emptied slowly, people moving like survivors of some natural disaster, shell-shocked and struggling to process what they had experienced. Elena Martinez approached Azura as she was gathering her notes and case files. "Detective Lane," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "Thank you for never giving up, for making him tell us the truth. At least now I can bring Jessica home." The simple gratitude broke something loose in Azura's chest, and she found herself fighting back tears for the first time since the ordeal began. "She was never forgotten," she managed to say. None of them were ever forgotten. But even as she spoke the words, Azura knew that the hardest part was yet to come. They would have to find the bodies, would have to excavate graves that had been hidden for years, would have to piece together the physical evidence that would support Whitmore's confessions in court. And somewhere in Tucson, there was another family who didn't even know they had a reason to hope, who might still be wondering what happened to a little boy named Danny who disappeared 20 years ago and never came home. The search for the dead was just beginning, but at least now they knew where to look, and in the calculus of justice that Azura had learned over 30 years of police work, that was a form of victory, even if it felt too much like defeat to celebrate. The recovery operations began 3 days later, with teams of forensic archaeologists, crime scene technicians, and search and rescue specialists spreading across the Arizona landscape like a grim treasure hunt guided by a killer's memories. Azura stood at the edge of the construction site north of Cave Creek, where Jessica Martinez had supposedly been buried 18 years earlier, watching as ground-penetrating radar swept back and forth across what had once been intended as a foundation, but had become a grave instead.
The October morning was crisp and clear, the kind of perfect Arizona weather that brought tourists and snowbirds flocking to the desert. But there was nothing beautiful about the work being done here, nothing peaceful about the careful excavation of earth that had kept its secrets for nearly 2 decades. Elena Martinez stood beside her, silent and still as a statue, her eyes fixed on the spot where the GPR had detected an anomaly consistent with human remains. She had insisted on being present for the recovery, despite warnings from victims' advocates and social workers about the traumatic nature of what they might find. "I need to be here when they bring her up," Elena had said simply. "She has been alone down there for 18 years. The least I can do is be here when she finally comes home." The excavation was painstakingly slow, each layer of earth carefully removed and sifted for evidence. Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic anthropologist leading the recovery team, explained the process in the kind of clinical terms that helped everyone maintain professional distance from the emotional reality of what they were doing. "We're looking for anything that might provide additional evidence. Clothing fibers, personal effects, anything that might corroborate Mr. Whitmore's confession or provide additional insight into what happened."
But when they finally reached the remains, carefully wrapped in a tarp and buried 3 feet below what should have been a family's foundation, the evidence they found was heartbreaking in its innocence. A small backpack, faded but still recognizable as the one Jessica had been carrying when she disappeared. A pair of sneakers, size 3, with cartoon characters on the sides. And most devastating of all, a small silver locket that Elena recognized immediately. "I gave that to her for her 8th birthday," Elena whispered, her voice breaking as Dr. Chen carefully bagged the locket as evidence. "She never took it off, said it made her feel close to me even when I wasn't there." The recovery of Jessica's remains was repeated across 4 other locations over the following 2 weeks. Each site presented its own challenges. Timothy Rodriguez's body required a dangerous descent into an abandoned mine shaft in South Mountain Park, while Angela Foster's remains had to be recovered by divers who worked in the cold, murky depths of Lake Pleasant. Marcus Williams proved the most difficult to find, hidden as he was in a cave system deep in the Superstition Mountains that required a team of experienced spelunkers and rock climbers to access. But they found him there, in a natural chamber that Whitmore had described with surprising accuracy, his small skeleton surrounded by the desert flowers that grew wild in the mountain caves during the brief spring blooming season. With each recovery, Azura felt a piece of the weight she had been carrying for 16 years lifting from her shoulders, but it was replaced by something else, a deeper understanding of the scope of Whitmore's crimes, a recognition that the 5 families she had been working with were just the beginning of a much larger story. The investigation into the 6th victim, the boy known only as Danny from Tucson, proved more challenging. Without a last name or a specific address, they were working with decades-old missing person reports and construction permits from 2003. But Detective Maria Santos from the Tucson Police Department proved to be a tenacious ally, cross-referencing missing children reports with building permits and contractor licenses until she found a possible match. Daniel Reeves, age 6, had disappeared from his neighborhood in Tucson in March 2003. His case had received minimal attention at the time. His family was poor, his father had a criminal record, and the initial assumption had been that he had simply wandered off and gotten lost in the desert. When no body was found after extensive searches, the case had gradually faded from public attention. His mother, Rosa, died 5 years ago, Detective Santos explained during a phone call with Azura. Never stopped believing he was alive somewhere, never gave up hope that he would come home. His sister Linda is the only family left. She's agreed to let us excavate the property if we can get the current owner's permission. The house where Daniel Reeves had allegedly been buried had changed hands 3 times since 2003, and the current owners, a young couple with 2 small children, were understandably disturbed by the revelation that their backyard patio might be covering a child's grave.
but they agreed to the excavation, moving their own children to stay with relatives while the work was conducted. Linda Reeves was 35 now, a middle school teacher who had built her career around protecting children because she had been unable to protect her little brother. She stood in the backyard of the house where Daniel had supposedly died, watching his workers carefully remove patio stones and began the delicate process of excavation. "I was 12 when Danny disappeared," she told Azura, her voice steady but strained. "Old enough to remember him perfectly, old enough to take care of him sometimes, but not old enough to protect him when it mattered." The guilt in her voice was familiar to Azura. She had heard it from thousands of family members over the years, the irrational but persistent belief that somehow they should have been able to prevent the unpreventable. It was one of the cruelest aspects of violent crime, the way it made victims out of everyone who had loved the original target. "You were a child yourself," Azura said gently. "This wasn't your responsibility, and it wasn't your fault. I know that in my head, but my heart has never quite believed it."
The excavation beneath the patio revealed the remains of a small child, along with fragments of clothing and a toy truck that Linda immediately recognized as Daniel's favorite. But more importantly, it revealed evidence that contradicted Whitmore's claim that this death had been accidental. The skull showed signs of blunt force trauma, and the position of the body suggested that Daniel had been deliberately buried rather than hastily concealed after an accident. "This wasn't an accident," Dr. Chen confirmed after examining the remains. "This child was murdered, just like the others." The revelation meant that Thomas Whitmore had been lying about at least part of his confession, minimizing his culpability in Daniel's death by claiming it had been unintentional. It raised questions about what other details he might have distorted or omitted, what other victims there might be that he hadn't disclosed. But for Linda Reeves, the truth about how her brother had died was less important than finally knowing where he was, finally being able to bring him home for a proper burial. "I used to dream about him," she said, as Daniel's remains were carefully transported to the medical examiner's office. "He would come to me in my sleep, asking why I never came to find him. Now I can tell him that we never stopped looking, that we never forgot about him." The media coverage of the discoveries was intense, but generally respectful, focusing on the family's long wait for answers rather than the sensational details of the crimes. Azura found herself giving interviews she didn't want to give, answering questions she didn't want to answer, but understanding that public awareness might help identify other potential victims or provide leads in other cold cases. It was during one of these interviews that she received the call that changed everything. "Detective Lane, this is Captain Rodriguez from the Albuquerque Police Department. I saw your press conference about the Whitmore case, and I think we might have a connection to some unsolved cases here in New Mexico." The conversation that followed revealed that Thomas Whitmore had worked construction jobs in Albuquerque, Las Vegas, and El Paso during the late 1990s and early 2000s before settling permanently in Arizona. Each city had unsolved cases involving missing children that occurred during periods when Whitmore was working in the area. "We're looking at potentially 3 more victims, maybe more. This guy wasn't just operating in Arizona, he was working a circuit across the Southwest, following construction booms and leaving bodies behind." The scope of Whitmore's crimes was expanding beyond anything they had initially imagined. What had begun as a single cold case from Phoenix was revealing itself to be part of a much larger pattern of predation that had stretched across state lines and spanned more than a decade. But even as the investigation expanded, the original families were beginning the painful process of healing. Funeral services were held for each of the recovered children, ceremonies that mixed grief with relief, sorrow with closure. Azura attended them all, standing in the back of churches and funeral homes, watching as communities came together to finally say goodbye to children who had been mourned
but never properly buried. Jessica Martinez's funeral was held at a small Catholic church in Tempe, the same church where she had been baptized and where her mother had prayed for her safe return for 18 years. The sanctuary was packed with people who remembered the 8-year-old girl with dark curls and a bright smile, as well as strangers who had followed the case through media coverage and wanted to pay their respects. Elena Martinez delivered a eulogy that was both heartbreaking and hopeful, speaking of a daughter who would remain forever 8 years old in her memory, but whose spirit had finally been set free to rest in peace. The congregation sang Amazing Grace in both English and Spanish, their voices rising together in harmony that seemed to fill not just the church, but the entire neighborhood where Jessica had played and laughed and dreamed of growing up. Timothy Rodriguez's service was more subdued, held at a funeral home rather than a church, with his divorced parents sitting on opposite sides of the room but united in their grief and relief. Carmen Rodriguez had asked Azura to speak, to represent the law enforcement officers who had never given up on finding Timothy.
Timothy Rodriguez was 8 years old when he was taken from his family, Azura said, looking out at the assembled mourners. For 15 years he existed in a terrible limbo, not alive, but not properly mourned. Today, we finally bring him home. Today, we finally let him rest. Angela Foster's funeral was the most difficult for Azura to attend, largely because Sarah Foster's remarriage had created a complex family dynamic that made grief even more complicated than it naturally was. Angela's stepfather and half-siblings attended out of duty to Sarah, but their discomfort with the situation was palpable. It was a reminder that tragedy didn't just claim immediate victims, it rippled outward, affecting relationships and family structures in ways that could last for generations. Marcus Williams was buried beside his father in a cemetery on Phoenix's west side, the headstones now marking a family reunited in death, if not in life. Patricia Williams, despite her dementia, seemed to understand on some level that her son had finally come home. She sat in her wheelchair beside the small casket, occasionally reaching out to touch the polished wood as if she could feel Marcus's presence through the barrier between life and death. The sixth funeral, for Daniel Reeves in Tucson, was perhaps the most poignant because it represented the family that might have been. Linda Reeves had married and had children of her own, 2 young daughters who were now the same age Daniel had been when he disappeared. They stood beside their mother at the graveside, holding flowers and asking quiet questions about the uncle they would never meet. I named my youngest daughter Daniela. I wanted there to always be a Daniel in our family, someone to carry on his memory. Now I can tell her about the real Danny, about what he was like before he was taken from us. The completion of the funerals marked the end of one phase of the case, but the beginning of another. Thomas Whitmore's plea agreement meant that the families wouldn't have to endure the trauma of a trial, but it also meant that many questions would remain forever unanswered. The true extent of his crimes, the psychological factors that had driven him to kill, the possibility of other victims, all of these would remain matters of speculation rather than legal fact. But for Azura, the most important work was just beginning. The revelation that Whitmore had operated across multiple states had triggered a multi-jurisdictional investigation that would require coordination between dozens of law enforcement agencies. Cold case files from New Mexico, Nevada, Colorado, and Texas were being reviewed for possible connections, and families who had given up hope years ago were suddenly faced with the possibility that their long nightmare might finally be ending. 6 months after Whitmore's initial arrest, Azura found herself promoted to lieutenant, put in charge of a new cold case task force that specialized in multi-jurisdictional investigations involving serial predators. It was recognition of her work on the Whitmore case, but it was also acknowledgement that her particular combination of tenacity, empathy, and investigative skill was needed for the hardest cases, the ones where families had been abandoned by the system, where hope had been lost, where the dead waited patiently for someone to speak for them. The task force operated out of a new facility on the outskirts of Phoenix, with state-of-the-art forensic equipment and direct access to federal databases that had been unavailable to local detectives in the past. But the most important resource was the network of relationships Azura had built over 3 decades in law enforcement. Contacts in every major police department in the Southwest, forensic specialists who would take her calls at any hour, victims advocates who trusted her to handle their most vulnerable clients with care and respect. Detective Chen remained her partner, officially now her second-in-command, but the relationship had evolved beyond the professional hierarchy to something more like family. He had seen her at her lowest point during the dark years when Sofia's case seemed hopeless, and he had been there for the triumph when Thomas Whitmore was finally brought to justice. Now they worked together on cases that came from across the region, families who had heard about the Arizona arrests and dared to hope that their own missing children might finally be found. The first major success of the new task force came 8 months after its formation, with the identification of 2 more of Whitmore's victims in Las Vegas. Sarah Chen, age 7, and her younger brother Michael, age 5, had disappeared from a playground in 1999 while their mother was at work and their babysitter had dozed off in her car. The case had received
Significant media attention at the time, but leads had dried up quickly, and after 2 years of intensive investigation, it had been relegated to the cold case files. Construction records showed that Whitmore had been working on a hotel renovation project just 3 blocks from the playground where the children had disappeared. When confronted with this evidence during a prison interview, he initially denied any involvement, but eventually admitted to killing both children and provided directions to their burial site in the Nevada desert. "Those 2 were different," he said, speaking to Azura through the reinforced glass of the prison visiting room. "They were together, and the older one was protecting the younger one. It made me angry, the way she kept trying to shield him from me. Made me want to hurt them both." The casual way he described his rage at a 7-year-old girl's attempt to protect her little brother crystallized something in Azura's understanding of Thomas Whitmore. He wasn't just a predator who killed to avoid being caught. He was someone who was actively angered by goodness, by innocence, by the very qualities that made his victims worthy of protection. "How many others were there, Thomas?" she asked, using his first name deliberately, knowing that creating a sense of intimacy might encourage him to be more forthcoming. "How many children did you take?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as if he were counting in his head. When he finally spoke, his words sent chills through everyone in the room. "Enough," he said simply. "More than I can count. Fewer than you fear. Does it matter? They're all dead, and I'm never getting out of here. The exact number won't bring any of them back." The psychological evaluation conducted by FBI profilers suggested that Whitmore might be responsible for as many as 20 deaths across 6 states over a 15-year period. But without his cooperation, and with many of the potential crime scenes lost to development or natural erosion, the true scope of his crimes might never be known. What mattered more to the Azura was the impact of the work they were doing on the families who had been left behind. Each body recovered, each case solved, each funeral held was a victory against the forces that tried to render victims invisible, that wanted society to move on and forget about the inconvenient reality of lives cut short by violence. The task force developed a protocol for working with long-grieving families that emphasized dignity, patience, and realistic expectations. They learned to manage the media attention that inevitably surrounded high-profile recoveries, to protect families from exploitation while still allowing public awareness that might generate new leads. They built relationships with victims' advocates, social workers, and mental health professionals who could provide support that went beyond what law enforcement could offer. Most importantly, they never forgot that behind every case file, every set of remains, every DNA match was a family that had been living with unanswered questions for years or decades. The technical aspects of investigation were important, but they were meaningless without the human element, the recognition that their work was ultimately about restoring dignity to the dead and peace to the living. 2 years after Thomas Whitmore's arrest, Azura stood once again at Sofia Hernandez's grave in Desert Memorial Cemetery. But now the small plot was surrounded by 5 other headstones, marking the final resting places of children who had finally come home. The families had decided to bury them together, creating a memorial garden where parents and siblings could visit not just their own loved ones, but all of the victims who had suffered the same fate. Maria Hernandez tended the garden with the devotion of someone who understood that remembering the dead was a form of resistance against the evil that tried to erase them. She planted flowers that bloomed in different seasons, ensuring that there was always color and life in a place that had been created by death. She organized annual memorial services where families could gather to support each other and remember children who would have been adults now, who should have been graduating from college, getting married, having children of their own. "Detective Lane," Maria said, as Azura knelt to place fresh flowers on Sofia's grave. "I wanted you to know that Carmen would have been proud of what you did. She died believing that Sofia's killer would never be caught, that justice was just a word politicians used to make promises they couldn't keep. But you proved her wrong."
The words should have brought comfort, but instead they reminded Azura of all the cases that remained unsolved, all the families still waiting for answers, all the victims whose voices had been silenced but whose killers walked free. Thomas Whitmore was in prison for life, but he was just one monster among many. Every day brought new cases, new victims, new families destroyed by violence that seemed to grow more random and more brutal with each passing year. But standing in the memorial garden, surrounded by evidence that sometimes the good guys did win, sometimes justice prevailed, sometimes the dead were remembered and honored, Azura allowed herself to feel something she rarely experienced in her line of work: hope. The children buried here would never grow up, would never have the futures that had been stolen from them, but they would not be forgotten. Their names were carved in stone, their stories had been told, their killer had been caught and punished. In the cosmic battle between good and evil, between justice and chaos, between remembering and forgetting, this was a victory worth celebrating. As she prepared to leave the cemetery, Azura's found buzzed with a text from Detective Chen. "New case from Flagstaff. Missing girl age 8 disappeared 3 days ago. Possible connection to unsolved cases in Sedona and Page. Can you meet me at the office?" She looked back at the memorial garden one more time, at the flowers that bloomed in defiance of death, at the headstones that proclaimed these children had mattered, had been loved, had not been forgotten. Then she got in her car and drove toward her next case, toward another family that needed someone to speak for their missing child, toward another opportunity to prove that sometimes justice was more than just a word. Sometimes the monsters didn't win, and sometimes the dead did get to rest in peace. The work would never end, but neither would her commitment to doing it, because every child deserved to be remembered, every family deserved answers, and every monster deserved to be caught. That was the promise she had made 30 years ago when she first put on a badge, and it was the promise she would keep until the day she could no longer serve. This compelling narrative follows Lieutenant Azura Lane's journey from the aftermath of solving a child murder case to her eventual retirement, spanning a decade of cold case investigations that transformed how law enforcement approaches unsolved crimes involving missing children. The story begins in Arizona autumn, 3 years after the arrest of Thomas Whitmore for the murder of 8-year-old Sofia Hernandez in October 2024. What started as a single-case investigation evolved into one of Arizona's largest serial killer investigations. Whitmore was ultimately connected to 19 confirmed victims across 6 states, with another dozen cases under investigation. All victims were children aged 5 to 12, taken from seemingly safe situations and hidden where families would never think to search. Lieutenant Lane addresses the 3rd annual Southwest Cold Case Conference, which had grown from a small regional meeting to a major national event. Her presentation emphasizes 3 critical lessons learned from the Whitmore investigation. Serial predators ignored jurisdictional boundaries, forensic technology requires information sharing across agencies, and families never stop needing answers regardless of time elapsed. A shocking development emerges when DNA evidence from Amy Patterson, an 8-year-old victim whose case was supposedly solved through Whitmore's cellmate confession, doesn't match Whitmore's profile. This discovery reveals that Marcus Thompson, Whitmore's cellmate, who had been providing seemingly credible information about murder locations, was actually manipulating the investigation. Thompson had been using his relationship with Whitmore to gather details about unsolved cases, then providing accurate location information while taking credit for murders he committed himself. Investigation reveals Thompson was responsible for Amy Patterson's death and 3 other child murders initially attributed to Whitmore. Unlike Whitmore's opportunistic approach, Thompson was methodical, studying potential targets for weeks before striking. His arrest ultimately closed 6 additional cold cases. Central to the narrative is the memorial garden maintained by Maria Hernandez, Sofia's grandmother. Initially created for 6 victims, the garden expands over the years to honor
Victims from across the Southwest whose cases were solved by the Cold Case Task Force. Maria, aging from 78 to 85 throughout the story, transforms from a grieving grandmother into a local celebrity, advocating for remembering victims of violent crime. The garden serves as both a physical memorial and a metaphor for how memory can triumph over forgetting. By the story's end, it encompasses 3 acres with markers for more than 100 victims whose cases were solved through the task force's efforts. A significant subplot involves Azura's mentorship of Detective Sarah Martinez, a young officer inspired by the Whitmore investigation to focus her career on cold cases. Their relationship illustrates the passing of professional wisdom and moral commitment from one generation to the next. Azura warns Martinez about the emotional challenges ahead: cases that can't be solved, families that can't be helped, killers who escape justice, while affirming the importance of ensuring victims aren't forgotten. Years later, Martinez rises to head the Cold Case Task Force, delivering a keynote address at a police academy graduation where she echoes Azura's core philosophy: every case matters, every victim deserves remembrance, and every family deserves someone who won't give up on them. Throughout her journey, Azura grapples with the complex mathematics of justice. The narrative explores how 30 years of police work taught her that justice is more nuanced than the simple moral equations she learned at the academy. She develops careful ways of managing hope as a delicate commodity that could sustain families through years of uncertainty or destroy them if mishandled. The story honestly portrays the emotional toll of cold case work through Azura's interactions with families like Isabella Santos, whose daughter Rebecca disappeared in 2019. These encounters highlight the ongoing nature of grief and the weight of responsibility carried by investigators who become the last hope for answers. The Cold Case Task Force evolves from a regional initiative to a multi-state federal cooperation model being replicated nationally. This transformation demonstrates how individual cases can catalyze systemic changes in law enforcement approaches to unsolved crimes. The task force's expansion reflects growing recognition that addressing cold cases requires sustained commitment and resource allocation across jurisdictional boundaries. The story concludes with Azura's retirement ceremony in 2034, but her commitment to the work remains undiminished. Even as she prepares to leave the memorial garden for the last time as an active participant, she receives a new case request and immediately responds, "On my way." This ending reinforces the central theme that the work of seeking justice for victims never truly ends. The narrative explores several profound themes: the persistence of memory in the face of tragedy, the importance of institutional continuity in pursuing justice, the complex relationship between closure and healing, and the moral obligation to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. The story suggests that while perfect justice may be impossible, nothing can restore murdered children to their families, but the commitment to seeking answers and holding perpetrators accountable represents a form of justice that honors both victims and survivors. The memorial garden serves as the story's central metaphor, representing how deliberate acts of remembrance can transform individual tragedies into collective commitments to justice. Through Maria Hernandez's dedication and the expansion of the memorial, private grief becomes public advocacy, ensuring that victim stories continue to inspire action long after their deaths. This narrative ultimately argues that the measure of justice isn't perfect outcomes, but sustained commitment, the promise that no victim will be forgotten, no family will be abandoned, and the fight for truth will continue across generations of dedicated investigators. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.